Ma. The letter he left only for me. I found out I'd been written out of my own father's will on the same day I buried him. Not before, not after. Right there, at the graveside, while the dirt was still fresh on the mound and the flowers hadn't even wilted yet, my sister leaned over and whispered in my ear, "You should know. The house is mine now. All of it." Dad agreed. She smelled like Chanel No. 5 and cold ambition, and she smiled like she was telling me something I already knew. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just stood there in the February mud with my black heels, sinking slowly into the soft earth, feeling something shift inside me, something fundamental and irreversible, like a tectonic plate finally giving way after decades of pressure. And I thought to myself, he wouldn't do that. He wouldn't. What I didn't know yet, what none of them knew, was that my father had spent the last 3 weeks of his life writing me a letter. A letter he'd hidden somewhere so specific, so personal, that only I would ever find it. A letter that would unravel everything my mother and sister had spent 30 years carefully building. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me go back to the beginning because this story, my story, doesn't make sense without the ground it grew from. My name is Claire Alderman. I'm 34 years old, and I grew up in a house where love was rationed like something scarce. Not because there wasn't enough to go around in theory, but because my mother had already decided, long before I arrived, who deserved it and who didn't. My sister Diane was born 3 years before me in the spring, in what my mother always described as the perfect birth. She was quick, uncomplicated, beautiful from the very first moment. My mother would tell this story at dinner tables, at holiday gatherings, to neighbors and relatives, and anyone who would sit still long enough to listen. Diane came out looking like a painting, she'd say. Perfect skin, dark hair, big eyes. The nurses said they'd never seen a newborn so lovely. Then she'd pause, and sometimes, not always, but sometimes, she'd add, "Claire was a difficult birth. She came late, and she came hard, and the cord was wrapped twice, 3 days in the NICU." She never said it cruelly. She said it the way people say the weather is bad, like it was just a fact of nature, a condition of the world, something that had simply happened. But I was old enough, even at 7, 8, 9 years old, to hear what lived underneath those words. You were a problem from the start. My father was different. My father was Thomas Alderman, tall, quiet, with enormous hands that were always slightly rough from working weekends at a friend's carpentry shop, even though he had a perfectly good office job. He was the kind of man who didn't say much, but when he did speak, you listened. Not because he demanded it, because everything he said was worth hearing. He never talked about my birth the way my mother did. What he said, the one time I asked him, was this: "You came out fighting, Claire Bear. You always did. That's not a weakness, that's a gift." I held on to that for 34 years. You have no idea. Our house was a 4-bedroom colonial on Sycamore Lane in a suburb of Columbus, Ohio, a town called Meredith Falls that sounds prettier than it was. The neighborhood was the kind where everyone knew everyone and nobody said what they actually meant. Pristine lawns, aluminum mailboxes, minivans in the driveways. My mother, Lorraine Alderman, kept our house the way she kept everything. Immaculate on the surface, complicated underneath. She was a woman of preferences, my mother. And her preferences were not subtle. Diane's room had a canopy bed with pink and white striped fabric and a full-length mirror on the closet door. My room had a twin bed with a blue comforter that had been washed so many times the pattern had faded into a ghost of itself, and a small mirror on the wall that was slightly tilted, so every time I looked into it, I appeared just a little off-center. I used to think that was an accident. Later, I understood it was just a metaphor my house was living out in real time. Diane got dance lessons at the studio on Maple Street starting when she was 5. I asked once. I remember I was 8 and I'd seen a recital and I'd been so enchanted by the girls in their silver costumes that I could barely sleep that night. I asked my mother if I could take lessons too. She looked up from the sink where she was washing dishes and said, without pausing, without even turning around, "We can't stretch the budget that thin, Claire. Diane is very talented. It would be a shame to interrupt her progress." As if the two were connected. As if me taking lessons would somehow subtract from Diane's talent. I didn't ask again. Diane was beautiful in the way that gets you treated differently in the world, not dramatically, not in a way that would be rude to say out loud, but practically. Teachers called on her more, neighbors brought her cookies, boys looked at her and then looked away quickly and then looked back. She was warm to me in the way that costs people nothing. Casual affection, occasional compliments, the kind of sisterhood that is fine when things are easy and reveals its limits when things are not. She wasn't cruel. That's the thing I have to say because the story is complicated and the truth is complicated, and I don't want to make her into a cardboard villain when the reality is more unsettling than that. Diane benefited from something she didn't design. She accepted what was given to her without ever asking where it came from or what it cost. My mother paid for Diane's college entirely. The University of Michigan, a school that cost what it cost. And my mother wrote the checks without flinching because Diane had the grades and the ambition and the particular kind of polish that made Lorraine Alderman feel like she'd accomplished something through her daughter that she hadn't quite managed in her own life. For me, there was a conversation at the kitchen table the summer I was 18. My mother sat across from me with her hands folded and her back straight, and she said, "There are loans for people in your situation, and community college is nothing to be ashamed of. Lots of people find it suits them just fine. People in your situation." I've turned that phrase over in my mind more times than I can count. What was my situation exactly? I had a 3.7 GPA. I'd been accepted to Ohio State. My situation was that I was the second daughter, the difficult birth, the wrong kind, the one who came late and came hard and never quite fit the picture my mother had assembled for her life. My father paid for Ohio State. He didn't announce it. He didn't make it a thing. He just came into my room one evening in July with an envelope and set it on my desk and said, "For the first semester. I'll figure out the rest." His voice was careful and even, the way it always was when he was trying to say something large in a small space. "Mom doesn't know?" I asked. He looked at me for a long moment. "Your education is between you and me," he said. That was all. I went to Ohio State. I studied accounting because it felt solid and reliable in a way that other things hadn't been. Numbers don't play favorites. An equation is an equation. The answer is either right or it isn't. And there is something deeply comforting when you have grown up in a house where the rules shifted based on who was being evaluated, about a discipline that operates on pure, impartial logic. I graduated. I got a job at a mid-sized firm in Columbus called Hartwell and Briggs. I worked hard, the way people who've never had anything handed to them always work, with a particular intensity that comes from knowing exactly what's on the other side of failure. Within 5 years, I was a senior associate. Within 8, I had my CPA license, a small but decent apartment on the north side of Columbus, a cat named Gerald, and a life that was entirely my own. I built it myself, brick by brick, dollar by dollar, on ground that nobody handed me. And still, on holidays, I went home to Sycamore Lane because my father was there. Every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every Easter. I sat at that table where my mother would talk about Diane's promotions and Diane's new car and Diane's interior decorator and Diane's beautiful apartment in Cleveland, and I would eat my turkey and pass the rolls and smile. My father would sit at the head of the table and catch my eye, sometimes across the dishes and the candlesticks, and in that look would be something that sustained me. Recognition, apology, love. It was enough. For a long time, it was enough. Diane had gotten married at 28 to a man named Philip Hartley, who came from money the way some people come from a particular hometown. It was just where he was from, unremarkable to him, overwhelming to everyone else. They had a wedding that my mother described as the most beautiful day of my life, on a warm August Saturday at a vineyard in the Finger Lakes region of New York. The catering alone cost more than my annual rent. I was a bridesmaid. I wore a sage green dress that Diane had chosen because it looked extraordinary on her and merely fine on everyone else. I stood at the altar and held her bouquet when she needed her hands free, and I watched my mother cry the happy tears I had never once made her cry, and I understood at 27 years old, with my sage green dress and my dyed-to-match shoes, that this was how it was going to be. This was the shape of my life in relation to theirs. I drove home alone that night. I sat in my car in my apartment parking lot for a while before going in. Gerald was waiting inside, indifferent and purring, which was exactly what I needed. Then my father got sick. It was January 3 years ago. He was 68, and what it was his heart. Not a sudden attack, but a long, slow unraveling of cardiac function that his doctor explained in terms I understood better than most because I am very good at parsing complicated information, at finding the practical facts inside the professional language. The bottom line was, it was serious. It was likely progressive. There were things they could do, but there were limits. I drove to Meredith Falls the weekend after his diagnosis. My mother was composed in the way she is always composed. Her hair was set, her kitchen was clean. She offered me coffee and then talked for 45 minutes about how hard she was taking the news, how frightening it was for her, how she hadn't slept properly in days. My father sat in his armchair in the living room and looked at me with his quiet eyes and said, "Come sit with me, Claire Bear." And I did. I sat on the footstool at his feet like I was 8 years old again, and he told me what the doctors had actually said. And we talked, really talked, in the way that we always had. The two of us finding each other across the noise of everything else in that house. "Are you scared?" I asked him. He was quiet for a moment, then, "Not of dying. I'm scared of leaving things undone." I didn't ask what things. I should have. I didn't. Over the next 2 years, my father's heart grew steadily weaker. I drove to Meredith Falls twice a month, sometimes more. I managed his medications, made a spreadsheet, color-coded, with a schedule and dosage columns, and a notes section for side effects. I took him to his cardiology appointments when my mother said she couldn't face them. I sat in waiting rooms reading medical literature on my phone while Diane called from Cleveland and said things like, "Give him my love, and let me know if anything changes." She visited maybe 4 times in 2 years. Each visit my mother treated like a holiday. The good dishes came out, the guest room was freshly made up with the nice sheets, the refrigerator was stocked with Diane's preferred things. The house smelled like roast chicken and effort. When I visited, I slept on the couch. The guest room, my mother explained, is easier to keep ready if we don't use it too much. I bought an air mattress for the trunk of my car on my 9th visit and started inflating it quietly in the basement. My father saw it once and looked at me with an expression I still can't fully describe, somewhere between grief and fury and love. He said, "You shouldn't have to do that, Claire." "It's fine, Dad," I said. "It's comfortable, actually." It wasn't, but that wasn't the point. The last 8 weeks of his life, he was mostly at home with a palliative care team coming in 3 times a week. I took a leave of absence from Hartwell and Briggs, unpaid, because my leave benefits had been partially exhausted from a procedure I'd had 2 years earlier. And I moved into that basement with my air mattress and my laptop and Gerald, who drove down with me and adapted to the arrangement with the philosophical calm of a creature that has decided comfort is a state of mind. I cooked the meals. I managed the palliative team's schedule. I tracked his pain levels and communicated with his cardiologist by email, detailed, organized emails that got responses within the hour, because medical professionals respect competence and clarity. I sat with him in the evenings when he couldn't sleep. We watched old westerns on the small TV in his room, the volume low, the blue light washing over us both in the dark. My mother slept through most of those nights. She had a prescription for something that let her sleep, and she took it faithfully at 9 o'clock and was unreachable until morning. I don't blame her for that. Grief comes for people in different shapes, and hers looked like needing to not be present for the parts she couldn't bear. Diane came once for 5 days during that final stretch. She cried beautifully. She arranged flowers in vases around the house that made everything look, she said, more peaceful. My father smiled at her and held her hand. He loved her. I have to say that clearly. I've always known it. He loved her the way you love someone who came first, who opened the door of your heart before you even knew what love was going to cost you. But it was me he talked to. It was me who sat with him at 2 a.m. when the pain medication wasn't holding and he was awake and restless. It was me who held his hand in those dark hours and listened to him talk about things he'd never said out loud before. His regrets, his fears, the things he wished he'd done differently. And one night, about 3 weeks before the end, he looked at me with those quiet eyes gone suddenly sharp and serious. And he said something I've turned over in my mind every single day since. He said, "I left you something, Claire Bear. Not through the will. Don't look in the will. Your mother has managed that, and I don't have the strength left to fight it. Look in the workshop. You know what you're looking for because you're the only one who ever understood what that place meant to me." I opened my mouth to ask questions. "What do you mean, manage the will? What did she do? What's in the workshop?" But his eyes had already drifted closed and his breathing had steadied into sleep. And the palliative nurse had told me not to agitate him with complex conversations because his heart couldn't take the exertion of strong emotion. I sat there in the blue TV light with a western playing silently, and my father asleep, and my whole chest burning with things I didn't yet understand. He died on a Tuesday morning in February at 6:47 a.m., with the winter light just beginning to come through the curtains. I was with him. My mother was asleep. Diane was in Cleveland. I held his hand until it was over. I called my mother first, then Diane. Then I sat back down in the chair beside his bed, and I talked to him, out loud, quietly, for about 15 minutes. I told him things I should have said while he could hear me. I told him I understood now what he'd meant all those years ago when he said coming out fighting was a gift, not a weakness. I told him I was going to be okay. I told him I would find what he left me. The funeral was small and cold. February in Ohio has a particular kind of brutal indifference. The sky a flat white, the wind cutting sideways, the ground hard as concrete beneath a thin layer of snow. About 40 people came. Former co-workers, neighbors from Sycamore Lane, a few relatives I barely recognized. At the graveside, my mother stood between Diane and me, gripping both our arms. I thought she was holding on for support. Later, I understood she was holding on for control, keeping us bracketed, keeping the picture the way she wanted it. And then the dirt went down, and the people started to drift back toward their cars, and Diane leaned in close and said it, whispered it like a confidence, like a piece of insider information she was generously sharing. "You should know. The house is mine now. All of it." Dad agreed. I looked at her. At the familiar face. The dark hair, the big eyes, the expensive coat, at the expression that was trying to be sympathetic and landing somewhere closer to satisfied. He agreed, I repeated. They discussed it together, she said. Mom and Dad. It made sense. I'm closer. I'm more settled. I can manage the property. You understand. She squeezed my arm once, gently, like punctuation. Then she turned and walked toward the waiting car. I stood at the grave for a long time after everyone had gone, just me and the flat white sky and the sound of wind moving through the bare trees. Look in the workshop. I went back to the house that night, back to my air mattress in the basement, back to Gerald curled on my coat, back to the strange, suspended unreality of a house that has just lost the person who made it livable. My mother had gone to bed early again, her grief medication working its reliable erasure. Diane was in the guest room with the nice sheets. I lay on my air mattress and stared at the ceiling and thought about the workshop. The workshop was a detached garage at the back of the property, separated from the house by about 60 feet of yard, accessible through a door in the fence that had a specific latch only my father and I ever used properly. The trick was, you had to lift while you pressed, not press while you lifted, and for some reason neither my mother nor Diane had ever gotten the sequence right. They always rattled it and gave up and went around. My father had shown me the trick when I was 7, and I'd never forgotten it because he'd held my small hands in his large ones and guided the motion slowly, explaining it like it was important, like it was worth knowing precisely. The workshop was his, completely, unapologetically his. The one space in that whole house where my mother's aesthetic didn't penetrate. No curtains, no decorative items, no particular cleanliness. It smelled like sawdust and machine oil, and the particular mustiness of old wood, and every surface was covered with tools and half-finished projects, and the organized disorder of a person who creates things with their hands. I loved that room. I'd spent hundreds of hours in it, sitting on the work stool while my father shaped pieces of wood into furniture and birdhouses and picture frames, and once, memorably, a rocking horse for a neighbor's daughter's birthday. That had been so beautiful, the neighbor cried. I'd hand him things and hold pieces steady and listen to him talk, and he'd listen to me talk about school, about math, about the books I was reading, about the things I was afraid of. Diane had never set foot in it voluntarily. My mother went in once a year to tell him it was getting cluttered. I knew what he meant. I knew the space like my own name. But I didn't go that night. My mother or Diane might hear me go out the back, might ask questions. And something told me, something careful and deliberate in the way my father had spoken, that this was not something to be done with witnesses. I waited 4 days, 4 days of funeral food on the kitchen table and relatives cycling through, and my mother holding court from her armchair and Diane making phone calls in the guest room. 4 days of managing casserole dishes and thank you cards, and the logistics of death, which are enormous and relentless, and which, in our house, fell to me by the same wordless calculus that always governed who did what. On the 5th morning, Diane said she needed to get back to Cleveland. Philip was at home, she said, and she had a conference call she couldn't miss. She hugged my mother for a long time at the door, and my mother cupped her face and looked at her like she was something precious and finite. Then Diane turned to me and gave me the kind of hug that is mostly arm placement and said, "Take care of yourself, Claire," and got into her car and drove away. My mother went back to bed at 10 in the morning. She was exhausted, she said. She needed to rest. I put on my coat. The February morning was sharp and clear. That kind of winter day that's actually beautiful if you can get past the cold, all hard blue sky and light bouncing off the snow crust. My breath made clouds as I crossed the yard. My boots broke through the thin ice layer on the snow with every step. a crunching sound that seemed very loud in the morning quiet. The gate latch. Lift while you press. It opened on the first try. The workshop smelled exactly the same as it always had: sawdust, oil, old wood, cold metal. I stood in the doorway for a moment and let it settle over me. The bench where he worked was along the far wall, littered with his last project, which had been a set of shelves for the laundry room that was now never going to be finished. His tools hung on the pegboard above it, every one in its designated spot. He was meticulous about that. I thought about what he'd said. You know what you're looking for because you're the only one who ever understood what that place meant to me. I stood very still and I thought about that room, about every conversation we'd ever had in it, about the things he'd taught me here: how to identify wood by grain, how to measure twice, how to use a level, how to be patient. And then I thought about the rocking horse, about what he'd said when he finished it. He'd stepped back and looked at it and he'd said, "The best things need the best hiding place, not hidden from people, hidden inside themselves." And I'd been 11 and I hadn't understood that, but I'd remembered it, the way children remember things they don't yet have a context for. I walked to the workbench. Underneath it, on the lower shelf, was the wooden box where he kept his finishing materials: stains, varnishes, brushes in various sizes. The box was old and handmade, with a simple latch on the front and his initials burned into the lid: T.R.A. Thomas Robert Alderman. I'd watched him make that box when I was 9. He'd let me sand one side. I took it out and set it on the bench, opened it, stains and varnishes, brushes in their slots, everything where it should be. But the box was a double-bottomed construction. I knew this because I'd watched him build it. He'd built the second bottom in specifically, and when I'd asked what it was for, he'd said, "Safekeeping," and smiled, and I'd filed it away in the part of my memory where children store things they know are important without knowing exactly why. I pressed the inner corners, both at once, the way he'd shown me, and the false bottom lifted. Inside was an envelope, standard white, sealed with tape, my name written on it in his handwriting: Claire Bear. And underneath, a single sentence: "Read this alone." My hands were shaking. I pressed them flat on the workbench for a moment, breathing, steadying. Then I opened it. The letter was 7 pages long, written in his careful print, the same way he'd always written things: precise, deliberate, every word chosen. He dated it January 14th, the week before he died, when he'd been mostly sleeping, when the palliative nurse had started coming every day instead of 3 times a week. He'd been awake enough to write 7 pages. For me. I'm not going to reproduce every word. Some of it is mine, privately, for always. But here is what he told me, in that cold workshop on that February morning, in his voice so perfectly captured on the page that I could hear him saying every sentence. He told me he was sorry, that he had known for years, their whole marriage really, that my mother treated us differently, and that he had failed over and over again to stand up to her in any consistent way. He'd chosen the path of least resistance too many times. He told me it had cost him sleep for years. He told me he had loved me no less than Diane. Not 1 degree less, not 1 fraction. And that the evidence of his life may have suggested otherwise, but the truth of his heart never had. He told me about the will that my mother had, in the last months of his illness while he was weakest, brought a lawyer friend of hers to the house, a man named Gerald Fordyce, whom she had known for 20 years, and that between them, with my father's hand guided on papers he could barely read through his medication haze. They had executed a revision to his will that left the house and the bulk of the estate to Diane, with a nominal cash amount to me that was barely more than a gesture. He said he had tried to refuse, but he had been very weak, and my mother and Fortis had presented it as already arranged, as paperwork, as something he'd already agreed to that just needed his signature. He said he hadn't had the clarity or the physical strength to fight it, and he had always regretted not fighting harder. He told me that he had then, in secret, in the workshop, over 3 weeks of slow, careful work, with fingers that could barely hold a pen, done something to address it. He told me to look up a man named Raymond Alderman, his brother, my uncle Raymond, who I had met exactly twice as a child and not at all since. The estrangement was my mother's doing, he said. Raymond had questioned her treatment of me when I was young, and she had found reasons to exclude him from their lives. But Raymond knew. Raymond had been his witness for something my mother knew nothing about. He told me that 17 years ago, before his health was an issue, before any of this was imaginable, he had quietly and separately, through a different attorney in a different city, without my mother's knowledge, established something for me. Not because he predicted this exact outcome, but because he knew, in the part of himself that was honest about his own failures, that he couldn't trust himself to fight for me when it mattered. So he'd done it preemptively, when he was strong enough to do it right. There was a secondary estate, a property, in Raymond's name in trust for me. My father had grown up in a small town called Crestview in southern Ohio. The house he'd grown up in, his parents' house, which had passed to him when his mother died 20 years ago, had never been part of the marital assets. He'd kept it separate, put it in Raymond's trust, and over the years he had quietly rented it out through a property management company, and the rental income had gone into an account at a bank in Crestview, and that account had been growing for 17 years. He gave me the account number, the name of the bank, the address of the property, the name of Raymond's attorney. He told me that the house on Sycamore Lane and the accounts my mother controlled and everything Diane was going to inherit, that was the visible surface. That was the stage production. What my mother had fought so hard to control was, in the end, not even the most valuable thing. The house in Crestview was paid off. The account had over $260,000 in it. And then at the bottom of page 7, in slightly shakier writing than the rest, like he'd been tired but had needed to get this part right, he wrote, "You came out fighting, Claire Bear. You always did. That was never a weakness. I should have said it louder. I should have said it every day. This is the closest I can come to saying it now. I love you. I am proud of every single thing you built with your own hands. Now take what I'm leaving you and build something more." I sat down on the cold workshop floor with the letter in my lap, and I cried for a long time. Not the polished, composed crying I'd been doing in public for 5 days. The other kind, the ugly, gasping, total kind that comes from somewhere you usually keep locked. I cried for my father, and I cried for myself, and I cried for all those years on the faded comforter, and the tilted mirror, and the air mattress in the basement, and the sage green dress, and the casseroles I'd managed, and the hands I'd held in the dark. Then I washed my face with the cold water from the utility sink in the corner of the workshop, dried it on a shop rag, put the letter back in the envelope, put the envelope inside my coat, clothes against my body. Gerald, the cat, not the attorney, was watching me from the corner where he'd apparently slipped in when I opened the door. He blinked at me with the supreme indifference that is actually, from a cat, a form of companionship. "Okay," I said, out loud, to no one. "Okay." I went back into the house. My mother was in the kitchen, finally up, making tea in her careful way. She looked at me when I came in through the back door, and something shifted in her expression, a slight tightening, a calculation, and she said, "You were outside?" "Needed some air," I said. She looked at me for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then she turned back to her tea. "Your father's attorney is coming Thursday," she said, "for the formal reading, just so you know." Her voice was even, practical. She said it like she was telling me about a dentist appointment. "Good," I said. "I'll be there." She hadn't expected me to say that so calmly. I saw her shoulders do something brief and involuntary. Then she carried her tea to the living room and sat in her armchair, and I went downstairs, and I picked up my phone and I started to make calls. Raymond Alderman answered on the second ring. He had a deep, rumbling voice, the same cadence as my father's but slightly rougher. And when I said who I was, there was a long silence followed by something that might have been a sharp inhale. "Claire," he said, "I've been waiting for this call." "Did he tell you about the letter?" "He did. He called me from the workshop, took him 20 minutes to get down the yard and back. He wanted to make sure I knew it was done and where it was. He said, 'Ray, if she finds it, it means she's ready. And she'll be ready. She always was.'" I pressed the envelope against my ribs and breathed. Raymond's attorney was a woman named Susan Park in Crestview, and she had the full documentation of the trust, the account, and the property. She also had something additional, something Raymond explained to me over the phone in a careful, deliberate way that sounded very much like my father. He said, "Your father wasn't the only one who had concerns about how this was handled, Claire. That attorney your mother used, Fortis. Your father, before he got too weak, managed to get one piece of paper to me, through the palliative nurse, if you can believe it. Lovely woman named Terry. She knew something wasn't right." The piece of paper was a signed statement, dated November of last year, in which my father attested to the circumstances of the will revision, the medication, the presented paperwork, the guidance of his hand. It wasn't enough on its own, Raymond said, but it was a beginning. "A beginning for what?" I asked. "For challenging it," he said. "If you want to. Susan thinks there's a case for undue influence. It's not guaranteed, but Thomas wanted you to have the option. He wanted you to be able to decide, walk away with what he built for you separately, or fight for what should have been yours all along." Thursday came. The attorney, Fortis, the family friend, whose office was in a building on the nicer side of Columbus, sat across a conference table from my mother, Diane, Diane's husband Philip, and me. I had taken a seat at the end. I had dressed carefully. Not the soft, accommodating things I usually wore to family events, but a charcoal blazer over a black shirt, the way I dress when I'm at work, and something difficult needs to be handled. Fortis was in his 60s, silver-haired, with the particular smoothness of a man who has spent decades navigating things to outcomes he's predetermined. He read the will in his smooth voice. "The house on Sycamore Lane, the investment accounts, the vehicles, the contents?" to Diane, with the management of the estate going through my mother as long as she lived there, and a gift to me of $15,000. $15,000. The cost of a used car, roughly, for 34 years of being his daughter. My mother sat with her hands folded and her back straight, her face composed. Diane looked at the table. Philip looked at Diane. Nobody looked at me. Fortis finished, set the papers down, said, with the gentleness of a man delivering something slightly uncomfortable, "Claire, I know this may not be what you expected. It's fine," I said. Silence. "It's fine?" my mother repeated. She couldn't quite keep the surprise out of her voice. "I understand the will," I said. "I have some other matters to attend to, but I wanted to be here today." I looked at Fortis. "Mr. Fortis, you've been my mother's attorney for a long time. I imagine you're familiar with Ohio estate law as it pertains to undue influence." The smoothness in his face did something complicated. That's a rather specific question, he said. I'm an accountant, I said. Specific questions are my specialty. I let that sit for a moment. Then I picked up my bag and I thanked him for his time, and I walked out of the conference room and down the hallway and through the glass doors into the February afternoon. And I stood on the sidewalk and tipped my face up to the white sky and let out a breath that felt like it had been building for 34 years. Susan Park filed the challenge to the will 6 weeks later. The grounds were undue influence and the question of my father's cognitive capacity at the time of signing. Raymond's signed statement was the centerpiece. The palliative nurse, Terry Vogel, a woman of 62 with a quiet dignity and an absolute certainty about what she had witnessed in that house, gave a deposition that corroborated everything. She said she had watched Gerald Fortis guide my father's hand to a signature while my father's eyes were barely open, and she had said something about it at the time and been dismissed, and she had not forgotten it. Not for one single day. There was also the matter of the account records. My father had been prescribed a specific combination of medications in those final months that, as I was able to document with his cardiologist's assistance, was known to significantly impair both cognition and volition. I cross-referenced the prescription records with the date on the revised will. The dates aligned in a way that Susan said was very useful. Fortis hired a litigation attorney and pushed back hard. My mother called me, the first time she'd called me since the funeral, and her voice was not composed this time. It was cold and taut, and she said, "What do you think you're doing, Claire?" "I'm doing what Dad taught me," I said. "I'm measuring twice." "He left you something," she said. "He didn't want this." "Mom," I said quietly, "I have a letter from him. 7 pages, in his own handwriting. Would you like to know what it says?" She didn't answer. "He loved you," I said, "even knowing what you did. He loved you anyway, but he loved me too, and he wanted me to know it, and he wanted me to have what was mine. That's what he wanted. All of it, not just the parts that were convenient." She hung up. I sat with the dead phone line for a moment, then set it down and went back to work. The case settled before it went to trial. These things usually do, once the documentation is solid enough that the other side starts calculating odds. The settlement gave me 40% of the estate value. The house would be sold and the proceeds divided, my mother retaining right of occupancy until she chose to leave, and a formal acknowledgement that the revised will had been executed under circumstances that did not meet the standard for full capacity. It was not everything. It was not a perfect vindication. My mother and Diane did not apologize, did not change, did not look at me with different eyes. I didn't expect any of that. You do not do this work for the apology. You do it because the truth matters, and because there is a man in a cold Ohio ground who wrote 7 pages in a failing hand to tell you that you deserve to know it. I also had the house in Crestview. I drove down on a Saturday in April, the world going green around me, spring coming back in the aggressive way it does in Ohio, like it's making up for lost time. And I turned off the highway onto the county road and found the address and sat in my car in front of a white clapboard house with a porch and a yard full of old trees and a mailbox with the numbers slightly crooked. It was objectively a modest house. Small rooms, old fixtures, the property management company's impersonal efficiency, evident in the plain curtains and the basic furniture they'd used for the rental. It was not beautiful in the way Diane's Cleveland apartment was beautiful, not polished and curated and expensive. It was mine. Completely, fully, inarguably mine. I walked through every room. I stood in the kitchen and looked out the window at the backyard, at the old apple tree at the edge of the property, the one my father had described in the letter, saying he'd climbed it as a boy and that it was stubborn and had outlasted everything. I stood at the kitchen window, and I thought about him as a boy in this house, before my mother, before Sycamore Lane, before all of it. Just a boy who liked to build things and climb trees, and who grew up to have quiet eyes and enormous, rough hands. I thought about how he'd spent 17 years building this for me, how he'd done it knowing he might never need to use it, hoping he'd never need to use it, but doing it anyway because he knew himself, knew his own weaknesses, and chose to compensate for them in advance. That's love, I thought, the kind that plans for its own failures. Gerald the cat explored the house with the systematic thoroughness of a creature taking inventory of new territory. He sat in each window for several minutes, assessing. He approved of the apple tree. I called Raymond that evening, sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the April evening soften the light over the yard. We talked for 2 hours about my father, about their childhood, about all the years my mother had kept us from each other. Raymond turned out to be a man of enormous warmth and a dry, specific humor that reminded me painfully of my father in the best possible way. He invited me for Easter. I said yes. I also did something else in the weeks and months after the settlement, something I'd been thinking about carefully, the way I think about most things, methodically, from multiple angles, without rushing. Gerald Fortis had been my mother's attorney for 20 years. He'd also been Diane's attorney for the estate management. He was a member of the Ohio State Bar Association. And what he had done, what I had documented, what Terry Vogel had witnessed, was not simply a civil matter. Guiding an incapacitated man's hand to a signature on a legal document while knowing the man lacked capacity is not just ethically questionable. It is, depending on how you characterize it, something the Bar Association takes a very specific interest in. I submitted the complaint myself. I wrote it the way I write everything, clearly, specifically, without emotion, with documentation attached. Susan Park reviewed it. She said, "This is excellent, Claire." I appreciated that she said it without surprise. The bar investigation took 8 months. At the end of it, Gerald Fortis received a formal censure and a 2-year suspension of his license to practice law. It wasn't disbarment. I'd hoped for disbarment, but a censure and a suspension for a man whose entire identity and livelihood rested on his professional reputation was not nothing. His website went quiet. The glossy headshot came down. Word travels in small legal communities, and in the Columbus legal community, Gerald Fortis became a name people said with a slight, careful pause. Diane called me in November. I almost didn't answer. I let it ring 3 times, looking at her name on the screen, and then I answered because she is my sister. Because some things are complicated. She said, "I didn't know, Claire. About the will. About what happened. I want you to know that." I said, "I believe you." Mom is... She stopped, started again. Mom is who she is. I don't know how to explain it better than that. You don't have to explain it, I said. I understand who she is. There was a long silence. Then Diane said, very quietly, "Was it terrible? Growing up? Was it as bad as it looked?" I thought about the tilted mirror, the faded comforter, the air mattress in the basement, the sage green dress. "It was what it was," I said finally. "And I'm okay. I'm more than okay." Another silence. "I should have been different," she said. "I should have said something." "Yeah," I said. "You should have. But you didn't know how to. And I understand that. And I'm not carrying it anymore, Diane. I'm putting it down. I don't have room for it where I'm going." I'm not sure she knew exactly what I meant by that. That's all right. She didn't need to. What I meant was the house in Crestview. What I meant was the money. The $260,000 that I had, being an accountant with a very firm grip on financial reality, already begun to do sensible and slightly exciting things with. What I meant was the Easter I'd spent with Raymond and his wife Ellen and their 3 adult kids, eating ham and laughing at a table that felt, for the first time in my living memory, like a family table where everyone was equally welcome. What I meant was the workshop. I'd had it shipped piece by piece. Not everything, not the heavy equipment, but the pegboard with the tools in their places, and the wooden box with the double bottom, and a few specific items that mattered. I'd set them up in the small garage at the Crestview house that I was now slowly, lovingly converting into something that would be, eventually, its own workshop. Not his, mine, but built in his language, with his tools as the starting vocabulary. I didn't know carpentry, not the way he did. I was an accountant. I was good with numbers, with patterns, with finding the structural truth underneath complicated surfaces. But I'd been watching and listening in that workshop since I was 7 years old, and some of it had gone in deeper than I'd known. I bought books. I watched videos. I made things badly at first, uneven, rough, not quite right. Gerald supervised from a high shelf I'd installed specifically for that purpose, looking down at my efforts with his particular brand of tolerant condescension. I made a small shelf, then a box, then one long weekend in early summer with all the windows open and the apple tree visible through the screen, a small table that was genuinely, actually, objectively good. Not perfect, but solid, level, made with care and patience, and the understanding that the best things don't rush. I set it in the kitchen under the window where I could see the apple tree. I thought about my father as a boy, climbing that tree. I thought about him at the workbench, steady and patient, teaching a 7-year-old how to lift while you press. I thought about 7 pages written by a failing hand, full of love that was all the more powerful for being this specific, this carefully hidden, this perfectly placed for only me to find it. I am 34 years old. I grew up in a house where love was rationed. I slept on an air mattress in a basement and wore a sage green dress and managed casseroles and held hands in the dark. I was written out of a will with a guided hand and $15,000 and a whisper at a graveside that was supposed to be the end of the story. It was not the end. It was the part right before the beginning. I have a house with an apple tree. I have my father's tools and his voice in a letter I keep in the wooden box with my name on it in his handwriting. I have an uncle named Raymond who calls me on Sunday afternoons and sounds like my father when he laughs. I have Gerald, the cat, who has decided this house suits him and has claimed the window seat by the kitchen table with the authority of someone who has always known exactly where he belongs. I have what my father built for me in secret over 17 years, and what I have built for myself over 34 years of coming out fighting, and it turns out that together, those 2 things are more than enough. My mother still lives on Sycamore Lane. The house is on the market. The settlement required it. I don't know where she'll go. I don't spend a great deal of time thinking about it, which is a new development and a relief. Diane bought an apartment in a building she likes in Cleveland, and she has since November texted me occasionally. Nothing heavy, just small things, a photo of something she thought I'd find funny, a question about a recipe. I answer, we are not close. We are not estranged. We are in the particular territory that is available to sisters who did not have the start they deserved, but are choosing, quietly, to see what comes next. Gerald Fortis is still suspended. I've heard through the particular grapevine of professional communities that he's found some limited work consulting, but the glossy headshot stays down. I don't think about him much either. The point was never punishment for its own sake. The point was that a wrong deserved to be named and recorded, and now it has been. The point was always the letter. 7 pages. Blue ink on yellow legal pad paper, written in the last clear-eyed days of a man who knew his time was short and chose to spend some of it making sure I knew, not just in a general, assumed way, but in the specific, documented, irrefutable way that I was loved, that I was valued, that someone had been watching and had seen the truth of me all along, even when they lacked the strength to stand and say it out loud in the rooms where it would have made a difference. You came out fighting, Claire Bear. You always did. That's not a weakness. That's a gift. I keep that line in the wooden box, too. I wrote it on a card and put it under the letter. On the bad days? The ones when the old narratives try to reassert themselves, when I hear my mother's voice in my head talking about difficult births and thin budgets and situations. I open the box and I read it. And then I go out to the workshop. I lift while I press. The door swings open. I build things.